Hello, Dynamo and Dash fans. Welcome to The Six, as it's called, a new roundtable discussion here. It's a forum that the club is kicking off this year. I'm Jerome Soloman from the Houston Chronicle, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's panel on life as a Black athlete in America. As you can probably guess from the name, it's The Six, but we only have 5 today because our plan was for there to be 6, but a personal emergency left one of our panelists not being available, but we have 5 interesting people who have had interesting lives and great stories to tell, and we'll be able to eat up all of the time with only 5 of us. I guarantee you that. So joining me tonight on the panel, our Houston Dash forward, Jamia Fields, the club's head of human resources and former Olympian, and ... et cetera. She's done so much in her life, Carol Lewis, and a couple of NAACP Houston board members, Belinda, Everett, and Nicholas Little. Welcome all of you into the show. And because this is a Dash Dynamo show, we'll start off with Jamia Fields, who's probably the youngest one. I look good for my age, but she's probably the youngest one on the panel. And we're talking about life as a Black athlete in America. And I know, Jamia, you are that. You're living that experience right now. And I think even that world as a Black athlete in America has changed since you started playing soccer when you were a kid to where you are now and what's happened over the last couple of years. So I want you to dive into that for me now and talk about what it is for you as a Black athlete. Do you stand out now like you used to when you were a kid and you were probably one of the few Black kids on a team, and now it's a little bit different? And do you feel any pressure to be a little more socially active than you might have thought you would have been as a kid?
Right. So growing up in Southern California, predominantly white area, always one of the, like you said, one of the only Black girls on my team. It was pretty hard to navigate, but it was pretty normal to me. I always felt like I became comfortable not looking like everyone. So that was kind of like my position that I had. But actually going to Florida State, I showed up my freshman year and there was 6 Black women on the team. So I kind of got both sides of, being the only Black girl on the team and then going to Florida State and having them surrounding me in the city, Tallahassee. It's a really, it's a Black community, and it was completely opposite than growing up in Rancho Cucamonga. So, but transitioning into my pro career, I mean, these are some of the first conversations 2020 having around race, and I've been playing for about 7 years. I know I look 16, but I'm 27. So it has been interesting finding my voice, talking about race within my team, on my social media. So it's been a year 2020, 21 going into, but I'm enjoying these discussions.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk a little bit about your experience, because I think it means a lot into this discussion because you're active now and you're involved in it. And yeah, you're right. When I looked at the 2014 team photo of the roster from Florida State, and I was wowed by all the Black women that were on that team, a national championship team. And yeah, I'll pat you on the back. You scored the game-winning goal in the national championship game. So yeah, go ahead. We'll applaud that. But it was a much more diverse group than you would normally expect in that type of a sport. And I'll go to Carol Lewis here, who is, when she was in the sport, the women's sports weren't nearly as celebrated as they are now. And in track and field, obviously, there were a lot of Black women who were running along with her. But man, later on in life, she's doing commentary on the Olympics, which is rare for anyone to do, let alone a Black woman. And then the Winter Olympics commentary, et cetera. You've been like a trailblazer. And did you feel some sort of different way about being a Black person doing what you were doing?
Well, I think when you look at your history, or you look at my history, And I will say, Jamia, if you look 16, it's good. Now you really love that you still look 16. When you get older, you're going to be saying, thank goodness for that. But I will tell you, I mean, I think that I grew up in a family of trailblazers. My mom was a trailblazer. And I think growing up with a very strong mother and a very strong parents in my household was extremely important to my development as a person. And of course, as my development as an athlete. My mom competed on an international level. She went to Tuskegee Institute, made the first Pan American team, traveled to Argentina, met Evita Peron back in the 50s. When that was unheard of. Some of the stories that they shared with us were amazing. My two older brothers were baptized by Martin Luther King. They lived in Birmingham. There was a lot of history that came with myself, my brother Carl, and I have other two older brothers, my brother Cleve and my oldest brother Mac. We grew up with that type of history. And then for me, I'm 2 years younger than Carl. He looks a lot older, I know, but
oh man, we're gonna hear from Carl on that one now.
Aren't you? One thing, he was 2 years ahead of me, and even going to college back then, I competed as a youth and internationally. Going to college, he got 6 visits to colleges to see where he wanted to go, to see what selections he would like to select. I got none. My parents had to pay if they wanted me to go to a college. I was around right when Title IX was instituted, when women had finally the opportunity to go to college and to earn a scholarship. And so, I was really came through in that time where women just didn't have a lot. So I think for me, it was more of a fight for women than even seeing myself as an African-American athlete in America. I myself as well grew up at a predominantly white Jewish neighborhood in New Jersey, one of the first planned communities in America. And so, when I looked around me, our community was incredibly integrated. When we moved from Alabama, when I was 2 weeks old to New Jersey, it was also a really interesting experience. My older brothers are 7 and 9 years older than me. So they grew up a lot of their childhood in Birmingham, Alabama. My older brothers went to the church where the young kids were bombed, the church that was bombed. That's where my brothers went to church. And my mom decided that that was a day that they shouldn't go for whatever reason. And the bombing happened. So even the difference between my young life and my older brother's young life was incredibly different. So we moved forward to where we grew up in a community where my brothers could now be on the Little League team. The Little League teams were welcoming. And so I never knew really that there was any limitations on what I wanted to accomplish. And then I have this mother who has fought and who has traveled and who has been exposed to so many amazing things that, for us, we were expected that. That was our expectation of what was ahead of us. So when I finally went to college, I went to the University of Houston on a full athletic scholarship and had more opportunities there. So as soon as I completed my athletic career and moved into the television avenue, I was just full speed ahead. And like Jamia said, when you look around, you don't see many people that look like you, but you know what? As an athlete, you're driven to achieve. And so I didn't really care if there was no one like me. And I think there's a really interesting story. As I had done quite a few Olympic Games for NBC Sports in track and field, I wanted to try the Winter Olympics. So I approached Dick Ebersol, who was the president of NBC Sports, and I said, Dick, I'd really like to do the Winter Olympics. And he goes, what sport? I said, bobsled. He said, have you ever done bobsled? I said, no, I haven't, but I will by the next Olympic Games. So I went and joined the team. I slid for the United States at the what's called America Cup. And then I was able to slide at the World Cup level. And in 2006, I was in Torino doing the Winter Olympics for NBC Sports. And the woman that I slid in her first World Cup championships, she won a silver medal at the Olympic Games. And the one thing I remember is that when I was there was a comment by Bryant Gumbel that said, African Americans don't watch the Winter Olympics. What are they doing there? And that offended me because as an athlete, as an American who is, and a person who has represented our country, I would hope that anybody who is sitting at home who is an American is cheering for everyone who's competing. And I don't care if you're black, white, purple, or green, that you are engaged in wanting to see how American is done. But for me, to have the opportunity to go to the Winter Olympic Games and represent myself and represent the first African American to not only do a Summer Olympics, but a Winter Olympic Games, that was a great honor for me. But I also think in that way as well, for young Black women to look up and see the achievements if you work hard to get there. And I will tell you, it's hard work. And I still feel it's harder for African American women than anyone, because it's harder for women to get into sports, number one. But number two, it's harder for African American women. But if you can get there and you can show the way and you can do a good job, then you can show that it's possible. But I will say it's very difficult, and the hurdle is always just a little bit higher for us.
And that leads into, I think, a fascinating aspect of this as athletes with you and Jamia. You're an athlete, you want to win. You don't care what the competition looks like, what shade they are, how big, tall, short, whatever.
Thank goodness we're recording.
Yeah, I think we lost Jerome for a second.
Yes, we
did.
I'll restart there. I don't know where we were, but I can work off.
The transition is your stories are very similar, Carol and Jamia, and then yeah.
Okay, and so here I'll bring in Belinda here because we're talking to two athletes and their stories and what they dealt with. And I know your background and experience is in the financial sector, and particularly even real estate and banking along those lines. And people would think, well, what does that really have to do with sports? Well, I want to bring you in on athletes, particularly professional athletes who have done so much, and so much money is available to them. And Carol was talking about her family spending a lot of time in Alabama, and just recently Hank Aaron passed away, and he's from Mobile, Alabama. Athletes, Black athletes particularly, have been making money and doing major things in the community for a long time, but the discrimination in housing, et cetera, has affected all of us, including athletes. And I know you've probably seen that from up close and personal.
Up close and personal. I mean, it was basically the difference between doing a loan for Phil Jackson when I was in Chicago and doing a loan for R. Kelly, and just seeing how finances were managed. And before I address that, it's so interesting. I was telling Carol and Jamia that there's such a common denominator in their experiences, even mine. All the three of us grew up in very, integrated communities. The sports that we were exposed to was ice skating and gymnastics. And that whole experience gives you a limitless potential. You don't have any preconceived notions that the world doesn't hold just an infinite amount of possibilities for you. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you look at their performance and they're excelling in their sports, it's because that was part of their development and their entrance into the world.
And it's fascinating, though, that they're from different worlds. I mean, Jamia's from Southern California and Carol mostly from New Jersey, and you're right from the Midwest, yes. Yet you're three Black women who recognize the same things that you've seen in the world.
Yeah. And I was telling them how my dad bred horses, hunter jumpers, he was an equestrian, and the three of us both have similar experiences riding in our youth. And I can tell you that, and I'm a little older than you, I've never had a conversation where I've talked to someone who could understand when I said I rode a 3-gated saddlebred as a child and showed horses with my dad. So they knew that because that was their experience. But to your point about athletes and their exposure and experience with money, it's interesting that you say that. Part of what I do with the NAACP is financial literacy and housing education, but sustainable home ownership is key. And when an athlete, comes into money, what's the first thing they want to do? They want to buy their parents a house. They want to do that. And at one point in Chicago, I was working with some of the rookies in the NBA, just to kind of get them prepared for home ownership. And even since I've been here in Houston, I mean, in my community that I live in, there was a couple of Texans that lived here. And I saw one guy, the development that we're in, there were like 4 houses. And this kid was a rookie running back, just signed. And he thought when he purchased his home that all the land around the house was his. And so when he started constructing houses on all the lots around him, he's
like, wait a minute.
Yeah, wait a minute. So, you know, part of what we try to advocate with the NAACP and other civil rights organizations and just Black organizations that are trying to educate and empower our people is that education and information is power. And along with that, the better you equip yourself. I wish that, I mean, one of my goals is to establish a program where it's part of your rookie signing deal. You have to take some financial literacy classes. I'm not talking about you don't need to become some, stockbroker, financial savvy guy, know how to play the market, but you need to understand just the fundamentals. Because how many athletes, and I bet you ladies probably know some, they have a house here, they have a house there, they house wherever they were traded, they probably are house poor and they don't know the ins and outs. I literally had I don't even want to say, but I had a rocket, lived in our community, bought a house, got traded the next year and sold the house $200,000 less than what he paid for it. And those are the types of things that we can do better, but we have to but I mean, it's not really our fault. When you look at historically, institutions have not been pro or favorable to minorities. I worked in banking for, almost 30 years. And one of my very first early assignments was working in a bank. And I used to see elderly Black people come into the bank, cash their checks, go downstairs, put their money in a safety deposit box. And I couldn't understand that, rather than put it in an interest-bearing account so it can earn some money. No, because people had historically had banking relationships, saved their money, and when it came time to go withdraw it, they were told, you don't have a banking account here. So there's got to be a happy medium where civil rights, financial literacy, and the sports industry can integrate so that we do make better choices and informed decisions about because you're not going to be an athlete. What's the average life term, of your career? Is it 10 years if you're lucky? So how
you're lucky.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
and that part of that, I think, is what you said. It's the history of these institutions that were not built and not favorable to African Americans throughout their history. And now we're making inroads there. So you have athletes who are coming into money, and it's not about them being bad with money or being irresponsible. They're stepping into situations where no one in their family has any experience in that area at all. And that eventually, as we move from generation to generation, that will change. I'll take that into the same thing as I kind of mentioned earlier with you all being from different parts of the country. And I like this diverse panel. So like Nicholas is from a place totally different from everyone else. And he's been in Houston for a few years. And I'd like for Nicholas, for you to address the thoughts of, you go from place to place, and everyone here on this panel, I can tell, has traveled all over and been in a lot of places. You still see the same issues involving the Black community, and people want to say, you're an athlete, you're immune from those conditions, and it's just not true.
Right. And I'll say this, today, actually, the Houston Rockets are playing my hometown. They're playing the Charlotte Hornets. I was watching that earlier. And I was thinking about this panel, and it made me reflect on just a simple fact that I do hear a lot of people who say, hey, like LeBron James and different athletes shouldn't speak on political or social injustice issues. But at the same time, the people that are in sports are heroes to younger people and old people alike. past and present. So it's important that with them being such a pivotal part of the working machine of our community, especially if they're coming from communities of color, they utilize their voice, because at the end of the day, it's a father leader thing to a certain extent. If they speak up, we're more likely to speak up. If they point out certain issues that are affecting the Black community and realize that it's not about the fact that I'm an athlete and I have money or whatever the situation may be, but it's about the betterment and the empowerment of my people and sustaining my people and sustaining the culture and protecting the people's interests. They're not, of course, they're not politicians, by no means. They're not politicians, but it is good to hear from our sports heroes and from our sports players of color that I hear you. I hear my fans. I hear my fans are suffering. My fans are going through things in their communities, and when they do speak out, I think it's wonderful, and I think it gives a lot of people, especially millennials and going forward, as they step into those roles and become the inheritors of those legacies that the current sports players are building. It'll also make sure that we continue to speak up for ourselves as well, and they'll do the same thing.
Excellent indeed. And I'm going to ask Jamila along those lines, does she feel some sense of responsibility to speak out? But before I do that, I'm going to put her in a bad place, because I'm going to go to Carol. Carol, back in the day, you spoke out about things regularly. And I saw a quote from you where you took umbrage at people saying that you were outspoken. You're like, I'm not outspoken. I'm speaking on behalf of what I know is right. And if I didn't do that, I'm half a person if I don't do that. So clearly, from the get-go, you felt an obligation to speak your mind about whatever it was. I mean, from the Southwest Conference track meet when your relay team was disqualified and you called it stupid and unfair, you were not about to be shy with your opinion. You felt from the get-go that you had a right to speak up, if not an obligation.
Well, now I do remember that, actually. Like it was yesterday. Actually, I come from a family of educators. My parents were educated, not only educated, but they educated us on speaking up for what's right. And, if something was not going correct and you know something different, then you should say something, not just let it go by. And you all obviously have seen over the years, Carl has spoken up, and he still speaks up regularly on different issues. I think that, things are so different now. We did not have social media. We did not have the internet. We didn't have all the things that you guys have now. I think in some ways that was good. In some ways that was bad. Good in some ways because I think the internet and social media has changed sports in a lot of ways and put a lot more pressure on each athlete because of expectations. I think athletes should speak out, but I think they should speak out when they feel it in their heart to speak out. I don't think any athlete should be expected to speak out just because there's something, and they shouldn't all feel like they have to say something. You mentioned Hank Aaron dying not too long ago. I've met Hank Aaron a couple of times, and so many athletes will put up a picture on Facebook of them with Hank Aaron or them with this person or that person. I feel like, sometimes for some people, that's a great way for them to remember Hank Aaron. But for me, I remember him by meeting him, and I remember quietly. So people also have to understand that not everybody is going to embrace the social media and things like that. And not everybody is going to be so loud and boisterous about their feelings, but they could be doing a lot of things on the side, or a lot of things that are very quiet that are serving their community. For me, if something was going wrong, I would mention it, especially in terms of women, because back then, women were here and men were out of the picture. And that's how it was. We were fighting every time for us to have a chance, for us to have an opportunity, for us to have 1/4 of what men were given every day. And I think in some ways, how we are now is kind of how the Black athlete is fighting to get to that next level. We're looking at coaches, for example, in the NFL. How many of those are African Americans? But on the other hand, how many of those coaches are going to continue to choose the backup coaches or the assistant coaches that are African American and that are carrying their teams? But for whatever reason, they're not given the ability to be a head coach. But would those head coaches have gotten there without those particular coaches? And we're seeing that in all different sports. how they're not good enough to be a head coach, but they're good enough to be the best assistant, and they're good enough to be on the field of play and teach how to do it. And so that's a big problem. And, you know, speaking out then again was different. I know Tommy Smith, you know, and John Carlos, they're friends of mine, and how they were persecuted for what they did. They were stripped of their medals. When they came home, they were disgraced. And they're just now, you know, I mean, they have gotten their lives back together, but they're just now being recognized for what they did.
It's fascinating now. There are people who celebrate them, and you know they weren't celebrated by many people at the time in 1968 in Mexico City when they did the Black Power salute. That response they got then, and it wasn't just everyone else, it was even their fellow competitors, their fellow teammates, even some of them, Black teammates, were like, you can't do that. And that's, I'll take it to Jamia from here. Do you feel some sort of pressure to actually to have to speak out? And along with Carol's mention of social media, how careful do you have to be and how you do it? I've seen, you know, that you're on Twitter and social media and you posted things, but do you have to be really careful of how you do it? Or do you feel like you must do it because you're a person that people are looking at?
Yeah, so initially, I just had those conversations with my family at home growing up, all these topics about race and speaking out, like it was just in my household. So after what happened to George Floyd, along with others, I just felt a burning desire, like Carol said, it has to feel right. I just knew I had to say something. And I'm just like, I'm going to use my platform. I know a lot of people say, well, I don't have that many followers. I'm just like, I feel it. And if anyone's listening, I'm just going to put it out there. So, and like Nicholas said, people are listening, people are paying attention to athletes. And I knew that. I knew I had some influence. And so, yeah, you have to choose your words carefully. I, you know, did editing. I didn't want to be reckless. I also took into account on how people would receive it, because I don't want to just come out angry, not saying that that is, because that might be the right way for someone else, but I wanted people to hear me. So trying to, you know, come out with the right message was important to me too. So yeah.
And Belinda, you've been in the corporate world for such a good portion of your life, and you've probably been around those discussions of what a corporation should weigh in on these issues, where what a corporation, the company should do in terms of the community. And so like an organization, the Dash and the Dynamo, they've decided that they want to be involved, that they want to make a difference in the community. What difference does it make when a corporation steps out and is active in that way?
You know, the first thing that comes to mind when I hear you ask that question is, I forget, it was probably one of the television shows that show a team behind the scenes, a football season. And there's the story of this young rookie who signs on with a pro team. And the coach says, you're welcome to the entertainment industry. You played sports in college, but now you're in the entertainment industry. You're in the NFL. So with that understanding now that everything you do is a part of a business, it's a part of a business, and you are a cog in the machinery of this business. And when corporations look at sports teams, when they look at coaching teams, when they look at what athletes say, they're all looking at it from the bottom line. And so 20 years ago, LeBron James couldn't or wouldn't have been given a platform to say, all of the NBA centers or arenas are going to be places where we can vote. That wouldn't have happened because at that point, corporate America didn't really understand. And even though we had Michael Jordan, but didn't understand the power and the economic power and influence that athletes have. At least they really weren't ready to embrace the Black athlete. And if you think about it, Michael Jordan played for many years. In fact, delivered 5 championships to Chicago before Jerry Reinsdorf said, here's $30 million. And even then, when he signed the contract, Jerry Reinsdorf looked at him and said, I hope I don't regret this. And he knew, Michael Jordan said he knew that he couldn't play for the Bulls another season after that. So it's important that I think the athlete, particularly the Black athlete, understand the economic power that they do have to an organization's bottom line. When you look at, I'm really, really intrigued by what's happening with the Texans and the Deshaun Watson scenario, because that's their franchise. That is their friend, not JJ Watt, Deshaun Watson. So
yeah, he is certainly that future, and that's part of it. Like
yes.
you have this economic power. How do you use it?
Yes.
And Nicholas, you're North Carolina, where Michael Jordan has transitioned from entertainer, as Belinda said, to mogul now and billionaire and owner of a franchise. He's in a different world than he was back then when he was an employee, and he didn't make a whole lot of money from the team anyway until his final couple of years with Chicago. He was making a lot from Nike, but that's changed. In North Carolina, do y'all expect a guy like Michael Jordan to be out front on these kind of issues?
I will say this: as a North Carolinian, to some it's touchy, and I'm gonna be frank. I'm gonna be honest. When I was young and I lived in Charlotte, I worked in the bar industry and the service industry, and I used to see Mr. Jordan. He would come all the time. He was a nice guy and everything, but I think sometimes some people may get complacent in dealing with where they've made it versus what's still going on around you. And there were times where I felt like he could have spoke up more on some things that were happening, and then there were times where he didn't. And then also saw recently where with the Black Lives Matter, where they kind of pressured him into some things, and he kind of came forward and said, "Okay, I'm gonna get involved and get engaged with this." But I mean, as I said before, I like, and it was stated before, it's not a requirement for sports athletes to comment on social injustice situations. But when you're a person such as like Michael Jordan, who is an icon and will be forever remembered for not only his footwork on the court, but also the legacy he's built just behind his name and what he's connected to, it's imperative because a lot of people look up to him. A lot of people look up to our athletes. And as stated before, pick carefully how you approach situations, pick and choose your battles, as Ms. Fields said. But at the same time, there's some battles that need to be approached, and as long as you do it the right way and you do it in a humble manner, I don't see why it should be a problem at all. So in North Carolina, we're pretty, North Carolina is a very activist state, especially our NAACP there. Their leader there goes to jail every couple of weeks, protesting for good causes for Reverend Willie Barber. So
I was just saying, yeah, make sure you add the protesting for good causes thing.
Right.
He's just not in and out of jail, right?
but it's warranted, and that's the thing. Sometimes my grandfather was a lifetime member of NAACP, and he raised me in it. And he told me, he said, "Son," he said, "every day you live your life, make sure you live your life doing something good for this one person. If you haven't done that, you just wasted time." So I just feel that in any instance, that if we can speak up on any matter that pertains to our community, that we should do it.
Carol has an up close view that very few people on the planet has of a brother who was maybe the most well-known person on earth at some point, or certainly on the list of the most well-known people on earth. And I'll ask her, on some level though, is it unfair that little me in Acres Homes, Texas, would be looking for Carl Lewis to say something? You know what I mean? And people all over the world like, I need Carl Lewis on this. And yeah, you had a brother who was willing to do that and did it, but it's like, boy, there's certainly a pressure there that's different for the rest of us.
I think in some ways, and as I said earlier, I think, and Jamia said, I think the decision to step forward for some is easy. For others is extremely difficult. Some people are extremely private. Their thoughts are their own thoughts. And I think that people should be allowed to be who they are. I think when you push people into a corner, you're sometimes you're putting people at risk. And I think that it just depends on the situation. A lot has happened in 2020. The Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd, COVID, quarantine. there were so many things that were going on in our lives in 2020 that I think there's not very many people who want to look in that rearview mirror and say, I want to go back there. Absolutely not. But I think it depends on the person. And, you know, Carl and I are extremely different. Carl's 2 seconds speaking up out there, loud and proud. And I'm not necessarily like that. I mean, one of the things I've moved away from sports and television. One of the things I did not like, and one of the things that was conflicted with me is that I had producers that wanted to see if you can make the athlete cry, or you wanted to dig up that little piece of dirt on an athlete and report it to people. And
They're
for
asking
me,
you to be critical when it wasn't
absolutely.
necessarily there.
Or even in sharing something that was extremely private, they might have shared with me and sharing it with everybody. And for me, that was conflicting because, you know, I think there's certain things that people have a right to keep private if that's what they want. And for me, that trust issue that they would give to me as a commentator, that they would tell me something and I wouldn't just blab it out like a lot of people do these days, where they're going somewhere and it's a private conversation and they've got the camera filming it so that they can put it on social media and look great. I think that's wrong. And so that was, you know, one of the reasons I got out of sports media, because they want you to be tweeting every 2 seconds and they want you to be doing all this stuff. And for me, sports is pure. Sports is pure and it's separate. You've got your activism, you've got that part of you, and you've got your athletic part. And I think I look at young athletes today and I baffle at how much pressure they're under, because they need to be a great sport. They need to look like this. They need to speak like that. They need to talk about this. They need to do this and then the other. And when the sports doesn't go, then everybody's on their case because they didn't do that. And they didn't look like that. And they didn't wear this and they didn't wear that. It's a lot. And the person who's sitting at home is looking at them and saying, but they're making all of that money, not understanding the pressures that they are under.
And
it's a lot of pressure.
That is one of the things that really jumps out is we think of these athletes and they make so much money and the world is theirs and
their life is easy. It's not.
It doesn't change with the money. And then we have, you know, in most athletes, LeBron James is on another planet, but the majority of athletes are working people. It's just their job is to score goals or to stop people from scoring goals like Jamia. And so what difference does it make, Jamia, that an organization like the Dynamo and Dash are, you know, allowing you to use your platform and not holding it against you? But, and I want to also get into what Carol kind of mentioned there. I know you're not 16, you're 17. But you've grown up where you throw your whole life out there for us all to see on social media. Do you have a filter, or are you trying to figure out a way of not sharing so much?
Well, I definitely appreciate that, you know, Dynamo Dash, I'm allowed to, you know, they're not putting any restrictions on what I put on my social media, and there's many conversations at the complex. So it's not like we're just going to play soccer and then everything else in the world doesn't exist. So that's been nice because it has been hard to juggle everything. But honestly, it hasn't been that hard I love that I'm in a time where social media is so huge, because I feel like it's been such an educational piece for so many. Obviously, there's a whole nother argument to that, how social media could be damaging to those. But in the area of educating youth with certain topics, and not only youth, but for me, I see it as a female empowerment tool, not only just females, but Black women, and as well as just the Black community in general. So I honestly love it. I know it's a different time than Carol when she
Absolutely.
was.
Oh, don't make us sound old. You didn't have to go that far.
No, but honestly, I am. I mean, you know, you could be my granddaughter practically. I mean, I'm older than I look, honestly. And it is different, but you have also grown up in a different time too. Right. You know, I think we're a product of our upbringing. We're a product of where we are and where we fit in the time continuum. You know, I saw something on Facebook and it said, remember back when? One of the things is that where was everybody? The only reason you knew everybody was at Johnny's house is because all the bikes were out front. You know, you guys don't know what that's about. you know, all of that thing, it's still different.
I was going to ask Jamia about how does she deal with the negative comments that she might get on social media. And I was like, well, Carol probably got people who sat down, took the time and wrote letters and mailed them in to criticize something that you said. Even by the time you got on TV in the mid 90s, people were still writing letters to complain about why is this Black woman on my television, probably.
It's interesting. They used to say if somebody wrote a letter, it meant 3,000 people thought that, but they didn't take the time to actually write the letter. That's what they would tell us when we were back in the 80s. But now people have a thing and they're making these comments. But I also think in some ways it's more caustic now. It's more mean now because you're not signing your name and you're not showing who you are. So I think now that athletes and people, it's mean because they can be mean because they're hiding behind a facade. So I think athletes now are subject to just so much more criticism and they're attacked so much more than they were in our time because most of those people would be at home going, but they never send you the letter, so you would never know.
And I'll ask you, Jamia, have you gotten, you made a post or said anything and the replies that come back, have any of them bothered you or to that level?
I mean, I've gotten DMs, paragraphs and paragraphs of, I'm just like, who has the time, but just of what I've done wrong or just tagging me with just name calling. You can imagine which name, obviously. I've just been, so that's been interesting because before 2020, I didn't really, I use my page as a motivational page, obviously, for young Black girls who are trying to play soccer or other sports. I just use it. So that's all like good. You're not stepping on anybody's toes. You are motivating only. So these comments that I've done in 2020 were kind of hard, but then I just had to go back to, okay, why am I doing this in the first place? And that kind of took me back to, okay, there's a purpose to this. And this is why I'm doing it because there's people like that. So
yeah. Well, but Belinda, I would ask you sound like a person who is a motivator and you've dealt with so much. What would you tell someone like Jamia in handling that criticism coming from the anonymous sources on a social media?
I think that, Carol said it very appropriately. People hide and, they have a lot of courage when they're hiding. And you can't put any stock into someone who is cowardly coming forth with criticism. The only thing that you can gain from that is, I had this little saying when, believe me, I've been in many a room when people thought it was okay to say whatever they could. I just said, I really feel bad that, your mama didn't raise you better than that, and you can't take it personal, but you have to make it, everyone has their own self-motivators, but, understand and be aware that that's there, but know that you are bigger, better, and probably far more blessed than the person who doesn't have anything better in their life going on than to spread ugliness. Yeah. And the fact that she has a page to empower, people, sometimes, people with insecurities and challenges, they need that. And then some people, it's not a whole lot that's going to do for them, but that's not really, you can't be concerned with those people. You just be concerned with the people that you can help.
And not at all. And I was certainly raised that way. And I'll give a little short thing and we'll go into this because like a lot of times you have these discussions and people think you're slamming the world and it's all negative about how bad things are. And I always try to put in, trust me, it's way better than it's ever been in many ways. I mean, my grandmother passed away a few months ago and she was 103 years old. So she was born in 1917 in a small town in Louisiana. Trust me, she saw some things and told me about the world in which she grew up. My father, my late father, he passed away a good while ago. When he turned 18, when I talk to people and they're like, why do y'all think it's so different? It's like, well, when my father turned 18, he couldn't vote in America. He didn't get the right to vote until he was in his 40s. So I take that right very deeply and seriously, because he would take me with him into the poll to vote, because it was a huge thing for him because he wasn't allowed to do that. But things are so much better than they've ever been, even with as far as we have to go. And so, Nicholas, I would let you start off with how you see the world now and where we are, and just in a general sense of, especially in NAACP, what you guys have done is historic from the start of the organization. How are things now and what you're dealing with, and is there more positives than negatives when you see the possibilities, I guess?
I'll say this. The NAACP is phenomenal. All the work that the branch does, not just in Houston, but across the country, is remarkable. And because of that, there's hope. And, and I think with people, sometimes people don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but there's so much that has been done, and so much is being done. Even yesterday, there was a press conference at our branch yesterday to change the name of a lake that was named a derogatory term that was offensive to African Americans. And even though some people may see that as a little thing, it's the fact that this is 2021 and we're still having to face issues like that. That's the thing. So even though there's some negative, there's so much positive that is coming out from this. There's so many people who are working hard to make sure that the future is solidified, is protected, and that we reach across the aisle to make sure that everyone is continuing to know that there are people, there are advocates and there are allies out here, and we're going to do whatever we can to fight and protect our communities and to make sure that we set an example for all people.
And Belinda, kind of along the same lines, and especially maybe even touching on like an organization like the Dynamo and Dash, where we've seen a cultural shift in the corporate world that they're accepting of this and even being allies. How can corporations be more allies to these causes?
This past December, we were so blessed with a donation from the Dash, and I got to meet some of your folks that work in your with your team and your players, and they wanted to come out and contribute and work. And as Nicholas said, we are doing so many things, and when you're working hard, you don't have a lot of times, and unlike our younger generation, we're not posting everything we did. But like this weekend, we went to a church and partnered with actually the NFL Players Association. One of the retired players owns a barbecue restaurant. He said, I want to feed people. So he said, I'm going to donate 500 meals. And that's great. But you know what? That from 10 to 11:30, we gave out meals. There were people there at 7 o'clock in the morning waiting. And so all of those things are going, it's hungry. Yeah. So all of those things are going on. And when we have organizations such as the Dynamo Dash that show up and just don't give a check, but say, hey, here's some hands, and we have 20 different advocacies, everything from environmental climate justice through housing. My strength, what I work on is making sure people have a place to live. But, just say, I want to be there. And we are so appreciative. And believe me, we have something for you to do. And you guys, the athlete, particularly the minority athlete, have such a tremendous platform. Historically, we have not had or weren't allowed to know our history, our strength, to have a lot of role models that were shown in business and finance and, a lot of arenas. But we've always had our athletes. And historically, our athletes, everyone, if you think back from Bill Russell, they've always held an activist platform. So continue to do that. And together we will make a difference in this world. We're doing it already. but there's just much more to do.
Indeed. Thank you, ma'am. And Jamia, as a current athlete who clearly you've decided not to just shut up and dribble the soccer ball, going forward, do you feel a sense of empowerment and you can see where you might be able to help? I mean, and clearly you've inspired young girls just by seeing you do what you've done. There are plenty who want to do it, but is there more that you see coming from you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the off season, I've never been on calls with my organization about what we're going to do in the Black community when I return back to Houston. And so those type of things are so inspiring. And like Belinda said, not just throwing money, but getting out in the community. So the Dash and the Dynamo, we have so many things planned that I'm excited about. And also I am on the board for the Black Women's Players Collective. And we're just trying to elevate the image for Black girls all over the United States, just partnering with brands, just trying to just elevate and pretty much empower. Because I feel like I didn't have something like this growing up. I wish I saw more of that, because then, like Carol said, I forgot what you said. It was like a little part about you just felt like you felt limitless. And I did too, but I feel like that's a small percentage. And that's why there's so many predominantly white sports. So if we can have these different platforms that encourage Black girls to get out there and play, to know that they can do it too, I think that's awesome. So that's what the Black Women's Players Collective has been doing. So, and we also have an ally group. So I think that's awesome, because it's also going to take the non-Black community partnering with us to get our missions done. So it's been very encouraging to see that there are some non-Black people who are just as motivated to make our vision come alive.
And Carol, we'll close with you, and I'll open the entrance into it with what Jamia was saying, that you talked about when you were younger and where you grew up and were around. The idea of you can't do something didn't exist in your mind and your family, and that's the way you're raised. So many others, and this is not just a Black issue, so many others are not raised with that limitless potential and their minds open to, they can do whatever it takes. What advice would you give to a young athlete like Jamia and others in being able to express that so that others can enjoy the thrill of victory, as it were, because we can all win at this?
Well, it's interesting. I look back and I look at parents and I say, let your young girl be a tomboy. And they go, what do you mean? I said, a girl always has time to put on a dress. But as a young child, as she's growing, you're going to fight. If you're a tomboy, you're fighting against the boys, right? You don't become intimidated by boys by fighting against them when you're young, because you don't know any better. So let her get in there and scuffle. Let her get in there and scuffle with them, because I scuffled with my 3 older brothers, and I threw a fist. I got smacked too. We fought. But when I got older, when I turned to a man, I was never intimidated by him, because I grew up being amongst them. But then I had the ability to put on a dress, put my hair up, and there I am. Okay. So that's something that you can empower your young girls with as a child, because it's very difficult to understand how to learn how to work against a man and get fight, let's say, in the boardroom with a guy when you're older.
Yeah,
you've done it as a young child.
I'm sure you, Belinda's been in those meetings where she's the only woman there and certainly the only Black person there. And it's like, well, we're equal here. I'm not subservient to anyone in there. Go ahead,
and it's
Carol.
easier to learn when you're a child than it is when you get older. And then also, I think one of the biggest things now is start the conversation. Now conversations are being had on every level. I will say, I work in the front office at the Dynamo Dash. And, right after George Floyd was murdered, our president, John Walker, he came to some of the African-American people on our staff and asked us to have a roundtable to facilitate something for our staff. We now have a diversity and inclusion committee. We're looking at different things to do within the organization. And this was brought forward by our president, who is Caucasian, and our leadership. And we wanted to empower our players to stand up for what they believe in, whether Black, whether Hispanic, whether they're white, anything, for them to be empowered to stand up and that they have a voice and they feel support by our organization. And I think the biggest thing is opening up the conversation, letting people come forward, letting some of your white friends come forward and ask you that difficult question and not judging them, but sharing with them. Because see, a lot of times people are ignorant about things because they don't have the courage to ask the question because they're afraid if they do ask the question, they're going to be attacked. We have to pull that layer back and let people understand that we welcome the question, because you will never find an answer unless you ask the question. And that's extremely important. And I think in all of the things that have happened in 2020, a lot of that has become giving people the opportunity to ask the question and people being open and willing enough to share the true answer, whether it become hurtful or not. And for you, Jamia, I will tell you, one thing you can never stop is that some of that criticism will hurt you. It will hurt you. It's natural because you're a human. And I've had people say things about me that are extremely hurtful, but in an athlete's way, I don't get mad, I get even. I don't get mad, I don't get even. I use those things to make me stronger and to make me push harder, to prove to them that there's something more of me and there's something more out there and that I can do better. And the person who criticizes like that is very small and they will fall by the wayside because all they're spreading is ugliness. And, you know, as some people say, God doesn't like ugly.
Not at all, indeed. Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you for all of you guys. And certainly thanks to Dynamo and Dash, because as you mentioned, Carol, like those questions are difficult. You want them to ask those questions and not be afraid of the answer. Well, organizations like Dynamo and Dash having this kind of a forum so that people can go, you know what, I need to ask those questions. I need to find out you don't know what you don't know until you can dig into it. And these are difficult questions sometimes and answers that you may not like, but without the discussion, without the conversation, then you just have blind, ignorant anger on some level, and that doesn't help anyone at all. And you guys are clearly a group who's, stepping out, making a difference. And I thank you guys for joining us. This was fun. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. I really appreciate it.